All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next in our series of webinars at the Buffalo History Museum. I'm Matt Holland, the volunteer and program coordinator at the Buffalo History Museum. This is a program that we're trying to continue our lecture series, albeit through webinars, and we're trying to do twice per month. And so this is like the first of the fall season that we've started this. So we're pretty excited to get this going. But I would like to thank our members who have continued support for the museum through thick and thin. And I think it's like with your help that we've been able to continue this program. So thanks a lot for that. But for this evening, we have Ryan Duffy, the executive director of the Holland Land Office, with us. And he's going to be talking to us about the Holland Land Company and its impact on the development of Western New York. And so we're going to have a short Q&A at the end. So if you could hold questions to the end, I'll if you have something that you really burning question that you need to ask, you can go ahead and type it in the chat. I'll try to write them down as we go, but it's usually just easier if we wait till the end. But just so you know, there'll be a little bit of Q&A at the end. And we're also going to be recording this Zoom session. So if there's any technical difficulties, or if you know of somebody who hasn't been able to make it to the session, it'll be available later on. So you'll get to watch it. Or if you just want to rewatch it, you can rewatch it as much as you want. So we'll share that probably early next week. But anyways, without further ado, I would like to introduce Ryan Duffy from the Holland Land Company Museum.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. I want to thank the Buffalo History Museum for allowing me to come on and share some of our history here at the Holland Land Office Museum. And I want to thank all of you out there for joining us. This is probably the biggest crowd I've ever spoken to at one time, but I'm really looking forward to sharing this with you, and I hope you enjoy it. So before we get started, I just wanted to share a little bit about the Holland Land Office Museum, in case anyone is not aware of us. We're a small local history museum located in Batavia. We're right on Main Street in Batavia, which is Route 5 for everybody else. And we are the Genesee County Museum, but we were established in 1894 in order to preserve the history of the Holland Land Purchase, which I'll go through in this presentation. But we have been open now 125 plus years, and we have all sorts of local history items besides items about the Holland Land Office and the Holland Land Company. We have things dealing with our local military past, the interactions with Native Americans, industrial pioneer history. So we have a little bit of everything. So we are open Tuesday through Saturdays, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. So if you'd like to come on by and check us out, feel free. We'd love to have you. So with that out of the way, we will jump into the Holland Land Company and its impact on the development of Western New York. But in order to do that, we are going to go all the way back to 1786, which is the year that the Treaty of Hartford was signed. Now, this treaty was actually signed between two states, New York and Massachusetts, over who would have dominion of the western half of New York. The dispute came about as both states' charters, colonial charters, stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And as a result, the western part of New York was right in the way of that, and they had to settle this. Now, the way the treaty worked out is that the 6 million acres from modern day Seneca Lake to Lake Erie were to be given to Massachusetts with the preemption rights so that they could sell the land, but New York State would actually govern the people that settled there. Now, the eastern boundary of this was at the 82nd milestone on the PA border, along the 77th degree of longitude, and this is in present-day Chemung, New York. So if you happen to be heading down that way, you can actually still see the boundary that separates PA and New York and marks the preemption line. However, when they ran the preemption line, it was actually done in error because it was supposed to run directly through Seneca Lake, but they decided to go a little farther east and went around the lake. However, that was corrected later on, but not a good start to the surveying of Western New York when the first line is actually done incorrectly, but we are dealing with a little more primitive tools and mathematics than we might see today. So now that Massachusetts has the rights to sell this land, they look for a buyer rather quickly, and they find one in a corporation called the Phelps Gorham Corporation, and they actually approved the sale of that land on April 1st, 1788. So the purchase price for those 6 million acres was $1 million, which was payable in 3 equal annual installments. And as Phelps and Gorham went through, they paid an additional $5,000 to the Seneca Nation to extinguish the Aboriginal rights to the 2.25 million acres in the eastern third of the purchase, which you can see on the map there. It's the one marked Phelps and Gorham purchase. And they set up offices in Connecticut in order to draw settlers from New England. As we go through the history of this portion of Western New York, most of the settlers are coming from New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, as they move farther west. But the office that they set up in New York, they set up in Canandaigua. And that became their area of operation. However, the Phelps and Gorham aren't able to continue their operation, as they are able to make the first payment, but by the time of the second payment, they actually default on it. And on March 10th, 1791, the 3.75 million acres west of the Genesee River reverts back to the state of Massachusetts. So the Phelps and Gorham purchase, which originally was the entire portion, ends up only being the eastern third or so. So now that Massachusetts has the land again, they're looking to resell it. And this is where Robert Morris comes in. And there's some more pictures, some more maps of the Phelps Gorham purchase, which gives you a little bit better idea. You have Seneca Lake on your right, and then you're going over, and the Genesee River is basically the western boundary of it, though it's not a perfect boundary by any sense. And there is Mr. Phelps and Gorham as well. So you can ever remember their pictures and their failure to settle Western New York. So now we get to Robert Morris, who you might be familiar with from the American Revolution. But he comes into play as after the beginning of the United States, he gets heavily into land speculation. And one of the areas that he actually sets his sight upon is this area that's recently on the market by Massachusetts. And so he jumps at the opportunity. First, he actually buys off the rest of the land from Phelps and Gorham for between 11 and 12 cents an acre, and then sells that eastern portion to what becomes known as the Pulteney Estate, which encompasses Ontario, Steuben, and Yates counties, as well as parts of Allegheny, Livingston, Monroe, Schuyler, and Wayne counties. And then he uses this money in order to purchase the western half. So what becomes known as the Morris Purchase was 3,750,000 acres west of the Genesee River. Now, Morris is a man interested in finance. That's what made him all his money through trade. He was actually the one who finances the Continental Army during the American Revolution, and was actually tabbed by Washington to become the first Secretary of the Treasury, but he defers and says, why don't you pick Alexander Hamilton? And the rest is history on that point. But after he actually makes the formal purchase in 1791, he looks to flip it as soon as he can. he actually makes this purchase without ever stepping foot in Western New York, so he never actually saw what he bought, but apparently he was quite smitten by it and gobbled it up as quickly as he could. However, within a year, he starts facing heavy financial difficulties from bad land speculation and looks to sell off Western New York to whatever bidder is willing to take it on. And he finds one in the Holland Land Company. Now, what he sells to the Holland Land Company is the western portion, which was 3,250,000 acres, and he keeps 500,000 acres to himself, which becomes the Morris Reserve on a 12-mile wide strip, basically between what becomes the Pulteney Estate and the Holland Purchase. And Morris had to do this as he eventually, his financial difficulties worsened to the degree that he's actually imprisoned for outstanding debts for 2 years. And this actually leads to a national legislation by Congress in order to pass bankruptcy legislation in order to save Morris, as a way of paying him back for financing the revolution, essentially. However, once he's let out of prison, he's in poor health, and he actually dies in 1806. Now, if you come to Batavia, you'll see Robert Morris mentioned several times. Now you know why, as his name was the first one really on this area, and it's he that actually brings the Holland Land Company in. Now, his sale to the Holland Land Company has to go through one more hoop, and this comes in the form of the Treaty of Big Tree. Now, this had to happen in order for the sale to happen. Morris had to be able to extinguish the preemptive rights of the Senecas to the western portion. Now, Phelps and Gorham had already done this in the early one, but since they defaulted, that basically was wiped clean, and the whole process was done again. Now, this was, the Treaty of Big Tree was hosted at the Big Tree Reservation, as it becomes known, and it was known as the Big Tree Reservation because of a giant oak tree, and there's a picture of it there for you. At its base, it was about 70 feet, or it was 70 feet tall and about 24 feet around at its base. Now, sadly, that tree actually was felled due to erosion on the bank of the creek that it was by, but there is a portion at the Livingston County Museum that you can go see, and we have a little chunk ourselves here at the Holland Land Office Museum if you happen to be interested in that. Now, the treaty negotiations began on August 10th, 1797 at the residence of William Wadsworth near present-day Geneseo, and there were about 3,000 Senecas who came to this treaty, and they're represented by many well-known chiefs, including Red Jacket, whose picture is there, Corn Planter. Mary Jemison was there, the White Woman of the Genesee. You had Jeremiah Wadsworth, who represented the United States. He was assigned that position by George Washington. You had Thomas Morris, Robert Morris's son, who was representing his father. And then you had members representing the Holland Land Company. You had Theophilus Casanova and Paulo Busti, as well as Joseph Ellicott. So that was basically the who's who of early Western New York, all in this one little spot. Now, negotiations went on for over a month, and mainly Red Jacket was the reason for that, as he fought long and hard to get the best deal he could, and actually fought the treaty altogether for many weeks until he realized he had no other support from any of the other chiefs, and that sale had to happen. Though negotiations picked up quickly once whiskey was sold, and after 3 days of prodigious alcohol consumption, the negotiations resumed, and a treaty was eventually signed. Now, the treaty was signed on September 16, 1797, and the total deal of the treaty was that the Senecas would cede the rights to the 3.25 million acres to the Holland Land Company, and they would receive $100,000 in return. And then 200,000 acres would be retained or reserved for them on 10 reservations. Now, that $100,000 was not truly $100,000, as it was to be given in bonds. And being that the United States was a new country and had very little money, these bonds took a long time to mature. And in the end, the Senecas probably only receive about half of that amount uh, as it's eventually paid out. Now, the 10 reservations that come about from the Treaty of Big Tree, many of them no longer exist, but a few you can still see today throughout Western New York. So you had Kennewagus, which is modern day Avon. You had Big Tree, which is in modern day Geneseo. Little Beardstown, which is in Cuylerville, and Squawky Hill in Leicester. Then Gardow in Mount Morris, and Canandaigua, which is near Houghton today. Now, those 6 were known as the Genesee River reservations, and there were 4 others that would be called the Western New York reservations. You had the Cattaraugus, which is Silver Creek, Irving area today. You had the Allegheny, which is Salamanca. The Buffalo Creek, which was the largest by far in what is now the southern part of Buffalo and into downtown Buffalo. And the Tonawanda, which straddles Genesee, Niagara, and Erie County. So those reservations actually go back to 1797, though the reservations that we see today are nowhere near the 200,000 acres that they were set up to be, as little by little, steadily over time, they are reduced through different sales to different organizations and to New York State. So with the treaty, the Holland Land Company now has possession of the land and starts to make their mark on it. So who's the 2 men on the screen here are the 2 managers of the land purchase. The first is Theophilus Casanova, and then his successor, Paul Augusti. Now, Casanova, you might recognize the name from Casanova Creek, Casanova Park. There's also Casanova, New York, out near Syracuse. This is the namesake of it. He was a Dutch agent for the Holland Land Company, and he's the one who actually finds Robert Morris out and starts the negotiations in order to gain the land. However, he falls out of favor with his bosses back in Holland, and he's eventually replaced by Paul Augusti, who you might recognize that name as Busti Ave. There's Busti, New York, down in Chautauqua County, but he was from Milan, so being Italian, it would be Busti, but it gets anglicized pretty early on, so we all know him as Busti. Now, the Holland Land Company was a consortium of Dutch banking interest, 6 banking families that actually get together, pool their money, and seek to invest heavily in new land opportunities in what is the new United States. Now, the land company pays a considerable amount to Morris in order to gain this land, but it really is worth nothing without surveying. But for many of you who live in Western New York, if you can go back on your original deeds, you will see certain names that pop up over and over again that are signed originally, and they are the investors in the Holland Land Company. You might see a name by Willink. Willink is probably the one that you see the most because he lived the longest. He lived until 1841, and he was the most heavily involved personally in the land company and into his own land speculation. And in fact, there was a town of Willink in Western New York, which comprised of you had towns such as Concord, Eden, Aurora, modern day Orchard Park, going up even into Boston. That whole area was called Willink. And eventually they split off, but you will see, if you go back in some histories, you might see that someone came from the town of Willink, and that is where it came from. But you'll also see a lot of the Dutch investors, their names pop up elsewhere. when Buffalo is being reorganized by Joseph Ellicott, their names are actually given to a lot of the streets. So you had Willink Avenue in early Buffalo, and I have a map a little later to show this. But Willink Ave was actually Buffalo's North Main Street today was called Willink Avenue. Then you had Nicholas von Stophorst, who was another one of the major bankers, and South Main Street was named after him. You had the Van Egens, who another one that were the couple brothers, Peter and Christian, and it was actually Christian who was the first director of the Holland Land Company. We have Hendrik Vollenhoven, and Vollenhoven, Erie Street today was actually named after Vollenhoven. And then probably my favorite is Rutger von Schimmelpenninck. I had to practice very hard to get that one correct, but he was the actual lawyer for the company, but eventually became a partner. And Niagara Street today was actually named after Schimmelpenninck, and I think we can all be very happy that they changed that one, because I can only imagine trying to give directions and say go down Schimmelpenninck Street. And then one more that you'll actually see a street pop up of is Standinski, and he was one of the other big brokerages, but those were the kind of five main ones, and others pop in and out. The Wilnick sons show up eventually too, but they are the main players that become the Holland Land Company. Now, the purchase of Western New York is actually not the first time that the Holland Land Company gets involved in land speculation in the United States. Actually, in Western Pennsylvania is their first time, and this is how they actually meet Joseph Ellicott, as he was hired to survey that land. And there is the entirety of the Holland Land purchase with the modern counties overlaid on it. But when this was originally done, this was all Genesee County until between 1806 and 1841, we go from one county to the 8 that we see today. So Joseph Ellicott, who is basically the reason why this all comes together. Now, Ellicott was born on November 1st, 1760 in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. However, when he was a child, they actually moved to Maryland, in northern Maryland, to a place now called Ellicott Mills, Maryland, where his father became a rather wealthy miller, but also was a well-known clockmaker. And if you go to the Smithsonian Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., you will actually see one of his tall grandfather clocks on display. Just a little bit of side history connected to the Ellicotts. Now, the Ellicott family is really one of the first, it really can be called the first family of American surveying. Now, Joseph actually learned from his older brother, Andrew Ellicott, who became probably the most well-known surveyor in the early American history. He was hired to finish up the survey of Washington, D.C., and Joseph Ellicott was actually his executive assistant in doing that. Andrew also taught surveying for the Army at West Point. He was responsible for the boundary between the United States and Canada after the Treaty of Ghent, after the War of 1812, and was responsible for a lot of other surveying lines that we take for granted today. But this is where Joseph learned from and became an expert at. As I mentioned, he was hired first by the Holland Land Company to do Western Pennsylvania, and it was here that he actually set up the boundary around Erie, Pennsylvania, and he actually sets up the location of what was called Presque Isle, now known as Erie. So he's brought back again after the Treaty of Big Tree in order to do Western New York. His Great Survey, as it was known, begins on the fall of 1797, and this was a massive undertaking. He had 150 men with him, many surveyors included, one of those being his younger brother Benjamin. And it is through this effort that they lay out 3.25 million acres worth of land and make it available for settlement. Now, it's not only that they set up this acreage, they also do a lot of other measurements at the same time. They were actually the first to measure the length of Niagara River and the height of Niagara Falls. And he also is the father of the 12-inch ruler. So that tool that we all took for granted in school, we actually have Joseph Ellicott to thank for. So before Ellicott comes along, the foot was not a standardized unit of measurement. We really didn't have a standardized unit of measurement on measuring length. So what he did is he actually lined up whatever foot-long rulers he could find at the time and took the average, and what he got was 12 inches. So that's why we have a 12-inch ruler. And in order to keep this standardization going, he actually made brass versions of that ruler and gave them to all of his workers so that they could use it as their standard unit. Now, Ellicott spent the first winter basically figuring out what he was going to do in Philadelphia and how he was going to lay it out, the boundaries that he needed to work on. So his lotting system, as it is known, basically he was going to set up 6 by 6 mile townships. And then within each township, he was going to have 64 lots of roughly 120 acres. Now, not every township was a perfect 6 by 6 square due to natural landmarks, but that was his plan. And besides that, he had to determine the course of the Genesee River, as it hadn't really been fully navigated in terms of mapping. And he had to arrange the specific boundaries for the Seneca reservations, as well as tell what the soil was like, what sort of flora and fauna was there, and what sort of crops could be grown. So this was a massive undertaking. Now this lasts from 1797 to 1800, and basically Ellicott is involved in every step of this plan, though there are several other surveyors that take the lead, Benjamin Ellicott being one of those. Now, once that's completed, the hard part wasn't truly over, as now they got to find people to sell to. And they actually looked to Ellicott to continue this, even though he had no experience in actually selling land. He was a great surveyor, but was not necessarily a natural salesman in that sense. So Boosty tabs him in 1800 after the survey to keep him on. And the reason behind that was that they felt he was the strongest candidate because, well, he had seen all the land, so he knew what was there. And they felt he was a very caring and honest man in managing the company funds. So he was not going to be one to ruin the company through bad spending. So that happens in 1800, but he doesn't really have a base of operations yet. And this comes about soon after, as he starts in Buffalo, 1801, but starts moving farther and farther east. His first, I guess you could call it permanent, but it's only semi-permanent, was he ends up staying at the Asa Ransom House in Clarence. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. But he wanted to move to a better location that would be more suitable for reaching settlers coming west and getting them to buy the land. So eventually he finds his spot in what we know as Batavia today. Now there's several reasons why he ends up picking this spot. The first, it was on two major Seneca trails at the time, which was really the only roadways in the area. You had what we know as Route 5 today, which the Senecas had going all the way across the state. And then you had basically Route 63 today that went from Geneseo up to Lake Ontario. So you had natural transportation routes. We are also on the bend in the Tonawanda, which made it a natural meeting place. In fact, the Senecas called it Nuandua, which was place of hearing. So it's often where they came for their gatherings and meetings on decisions. And it's also on the eastern edge of the purchase. Now, everyone's coming from the east, so he wanted to be in a place where they would have to come before they were able to get into the purchase. Though I'm sure he might have had other reasons behind it. Those are the three that I've been able to surmise. Now, the next big question is why did he name it Batavia? Now, it was called Batavia because that's where his Dutch employers were from. The Netherlands at that time was actually called the Republic of Batavia. So that's where the name comes from. Now, Batavia, New York is actually one of 8 Batavias across the United States. As you go farther west, you actually see Batavias pop up. And they can actually mostly be traced back to this Batavia. In fact, Batavia, Michigan is actually in Genesee County, Michigan. So uh, things never, names don't really change as you keep going. Um, but how, even though it ends up becoming called Batavia, that was actually not Ellicott's first choice for the name. He wanted to name it after Paula Busti, so we could have been called Bustieville. Um, I know I'm kind of thankful they didn't stick with that, as it just sounds a little goofy in the end, but that could have been the case. But never fear, Paula Busti got his own town named after him, except it's Bustye, New York, down in Chautauqua County. And Busti said, Ellicott, why don't you name after yourself? And they almost went with Ellicott's town, but decided that didn't sound quite right either. But Ellicott gets Ellicottville, so it all works out in the end. Everybody gets a town named after them. Um, so when Ellicott finally settles here in Batavia, he there's really nothing here. There's about 20 people living in the area when he comes in, and it's because of him settling here that Batavia grows rapidly. So he actually builds his house across the street, roughly from where the land office sits today. And the picture here is what the mansion ends up becoming before it's torn down in the 1880s. You had a central portion with 2 wings, and it was in the east wing, which is on your right there, where he set up his office. And that's where the first Holland land office was in a sort of permanent fashion after moving out of his temporary log cabin. Now, the building that we are housed in today doesn't come about right away. And here's an early etching of it. It's actually built in 1815 in response to the growing demand that the land company was facing. And they needed a more permanent spot. And so they built this building in 1815. It was a 2-story building with 3-foot thick stone walls made out of limestone from one of the local quarries, actually. They needed this type of building in order to protect all the valuable paperwork and money. All of their valuables were paper at this time. This was the account books, the land deeds, and the cash from fire. So not only did they have 3-foot thick stone walls, which were much better protection than wood, but they also had solid iron doors covering all of the 8 vaults that were actually dug into the walls of the building. And here is a basic floor plan of what the land office looked at. On both floors were separated roughly the same. There were 4 rooms on the bottom floor. They were all offices. This was built to be an office, so it was not built to be a residence in any way. And then upstairs roughly mirrored the downstairs. I'll go back just a little bit. As Ellicott is making his way with the Holland Land Company, he also becomes pretty adept at city planning, essentially. And he lays out the early village of Buffalo. And here is a map of that from 1805. And if you look at, not sure if you can read it real well, but if you look at the map closely, you'll see the street names are named after members of the Holland Land Company. You've got Bustye, you've got Stadinsky, Schimmelpenninck, Willink, Van Straphorst. They're all there. So that shows the impact that the Holland Land Company had on the area, as a lot of those Dutch names were everywhere. But not only does he lay out Buffalo, he also lays out early Batavia. So if any of you have ever been to Batavia, you'll know that it looks a lot different than it did when Joseph Ellicott started out. But these are the original streets. So Buffalo Street was West Main Street today. You had Big Tree Road, which was Ellicott Ave, and Genesee Street was East Main Street. but they all were centered around the land office and the bend in the Tonawanda Creek. Now, the land company was not only important to Batavia, obviously, but it's important to all of Western New York, as it's from the building that I'm sitting in right now that essentially all the land in Western New York was sold from. Everything basically west of the Genesee River. But in order for them to sell all this land, they had to make it accessible and they had to give it the opportunity to grow. And the first thing they had to do was to create roads. As before the Holland Land Company, there were no major roads in the area, especially not built for heavy wagons, as up until that point, water transportation was still really the only way to go. And even that was very slow, as there wasn't adequate land transportation going across the state, which is one reason why the Erie Canal is built. Now, right away, Ellicott sees this need and starts to build major roads. The first being what becomes known as the Middle Road. You can see it on the map there today, which went from Geneseo to just south of the Buffalo Creek Reservation. And the second one is known as the Buffalo Road, which went from Buffalo to Batavia. So the Buffalo Road is Route 5 today, and the Middle Road is, I believe, Route 20. So these roads were the basis for our major highways today and our major byways. If you look at the other ones, the Big Tree Road is Route 63, and the Oak Orchard Road is Route 98, and Genesee Road is the second half of Route 5 going eastward. But all of these roads branch out from Batavia, which is why Batavia is a hub for that nowadays. But all of these roads were basically built by the Holland Land Company in order to allow settlers to come through. Now, Ellicott becomes very astute at selling to small farmers, which was not actually what his bosses in Holland wanted him to do. They wanted him to sell large chunks to get rid of the land very quickly, but he realized that probably wasn't going to work, as there just wasn't the buyers out there in order to do that. And they probably weren't going to get as good a deal as if maybe they sold off little by little. So basically what he did is they put land offices out in New England in various spots to entice settlers to come west, eventually to Batavia as the central office. But as the other counties start to spring up, you have offices open up there. You had one in Angelica in Allegheny County, Ellicottville in Cattaraugus, Mayville in Chautauqua, Buffalo in Erie, and Lockport, Niagara. And Orleans and Wyoming come out a little bit later. So he makes very equitable terms for the buyers as they purchase land, and had very liberal credit terms for them, often giving them over a decade to pay the land back. The average price per acre was about $2.50, but it varied quite a bit depending on the area. And but a down payment could be as little as 25 cents. Just want you to let that sink in a little bit, as 25 cents to pay for as much as 120 acres. That seems like a pretty good deal. He also worked out other terms with settlers. This would include allowing them to just work the land for about 5 years, clear it, and make it more equitable, and essentially live there for 5 years while working the land, and then be able to, once that was done, they could sell the land off for a lot more money because it was already cleared, and then these people would go to another plot and do the same thing over and over again. So in some past research, we've actually found that people will show up in census records in one spot, or in voting records in one spot, but they won't show up on other records because they didn't actually own the land, they were just working it. But so there was different levels to buying land from the Holland Land Company, and essentially Ellicott tried to make it as easy for as many people as possible, and that's how he was able to sell off the vast majority of the land. And they also gave out loans in order to stimulate infrastructure. They would give out loans for people to start sawmills, grist mills, inns, blacksmith shops, schoolhouses, and churches, as they realized this was the necessities of civilization out on the frontier. And without it, they were not going to be able to attract as many people, and the overall lifestyle would not be nearly the same. And one example in Batavia was actually James Brisbane was given a $3,000 loan to start a general store. And he ended up staying for the rest of his life, and his descendants ended up staying and becoming a very prominent family in Batavia. So that was just one example of that, but you saw that happen across the Holland land purchase, and essentially allowed it to grow, but it needed financial backing, and it needed the land company to put its money where its mouth was. Otherwise, this venture was not going to succeed. As larger groups of settlers were coming in, they expanded the roads even more. But this time they actually funded the roads, though others created the roads through funding packages. So they built roads from Fredonia to Mayville, and then from Angelica to Mayville. So now the southern tier is getting more connected. And then also from Buffalo to Black Rock, as at that time they were two separate villages. But the Holland Land Company also plays a pivotal role in the development of the Erie Canal. In fact, the Holland Land Company actually donates 100,000 acres towards the building of the Erie Canal. Now, when I say they donate acreage, they don't donate the land that the canal runs through. They actually donated land in the southeastern corner of the purchase, which was probably some of the worst in the purchase, to New York State so that they can sell it off and raise funds in order to pay for the Erie Canal. So it was sort of a circumnavigating of that. So they didn't actually donate the land toward the Erie Canal. They donated land so that New York State could raise money for the Erie Canal. However, this starts to be when Ellicott starts to fall out of favor. He was basically the connection to New York State for the Holland Land Company. And starting in the 1820s, New York State started to really crack down on foreign companies and what they were able to do, especially in land speculation. And Ellicott was seen as the person who was supposed to take care of that. Now, in 1820, in the gubernatorial election, you had DeWitt Clinton, who was the major player in that and was the major candidate. And Boosty asked Ellicott to basically throw his support behind Clinton in order to gain favor with them as they had to deal with legislation from New York State. However, Ellicott fails to do this for whatever reason, probably some personal rivalry with Clinton, and eventually Clinton wins without the backing of the Holland Land Company. So this was basically the last straw for Boosty, and he asked for Ellicott's resignation, which happens in 1821. And this has a severe negative effect on Ellicott. And within 5 years, he's actually committed to a mental institute in New York City and actually commit suicide there. Now, just because Joseph Ellicott is out of the picture, the land office continues on for another 15 years after Ellicott's departure. In fact, his nephew, David Ellicott Evans, takes over eventually as the manager here in Batavia. But steadily over time, the land office's stature in the area declines, both politically but also with its tenants. And this reaches a boiling point in 1836, 1837, as farmers across the area actually start to rise up in revolt against the Holland Land Company. The most severe action actually happens in February of 1836 down in Chautauqua County, when a few hundred farmers actually get together and burn the land office in Mayville. What I have here is a picture of the stone vault in Mayville, which is still standing, but it's the only piece of the site that's left standing. The Peacock Mansion was built on top of that site. Now the Peacock Mansion has been torn down, but this is actually right next to some of the county buildings down in Mayville. So if you make a trip down there, you can actually still see it. But the main land office here in Batavia almost met a similar fate as in early 1837, in May actually, about 700 farmers come to the doorstep here and threaten to do the same thing. Now, David Ellicott Evans had gotten wind of this and actually had 50 armed men here in the museum, well, in the land office, today the museum, fully armed. And when the mob arrived, the local sheriff and militias actually showed up, and they left peacefully. So the building was actually spared with no damage or anything, but tensions came to a serious head, and people were very fed up with the Holland Land Company over new rates and heightened collection policies that were not necessarily the norm previously. And eventually, the Holland Land Company, saw the writing on the wall and packed up and left. By 1846, all the assets had traveled back to Amsterdam, including all the paperwork. And by that time, basically the whole assets had been dissolved and were actually taken over by other land companies, which were processing it. So this makes it sort of difficult to trace some of the records because we don't have them on site. They're not even in the country. But luckily, SUNY Fredonia does have some, and some have been digitized, so we can track that. But over time, we've been able to collect some of those original records. So, for instance, I actually have all the original land ledgers for Erie County. So, for anyone living in Erie County, I can most likely trace back your property to the original buyer. But the Holland Land Company is what makes Western New York, Western New York. Without its money and its projects, it doesn't grow as quickly as it does. Projects like the Erie Canal probably don't happen to the extent maybe that it does, and the cities of Buffalo does not become necessarily what it is, and Batavia probably never even exists, including some other towns as well. So I feel it's part of the history that maybe gets overlooked, but it's really what gets it all started. So I want to thank everybody for listening to me go on for a while, but I'm happy to take any questions now on anything and hopefully answer them as well as I can.
Well, thanks for that, Ryan. That's great. I've got like a good track of questions here. I've got them in chronological order as they were asked. So, and then I'll try to move on to ones that are being asked right now as I see them clicking in. But somebody was curious, the citation for the map in the first slide. Do you have a citation for that, or at least where did you get that from? The map.
Let me go back so I can remember which one was on the first slide. I don't have the citation right in front of me, but I do know that it is in a book called the Holland Land. I think it's Joseph Ellicott and the Holland Land Company by an author named Chazenhoff.
Okay.
It was written back in the 70s. I know this map is in there, but I know it's other places as well. So I don't have my exact citation for it, but you can find it in that book.
Well, and that's funny that you say that, because somebody also asked, the next question is there a book available covering this topic? So do you have any references for books that might be good?
Well, I've got it right behind me here, so that was fortunate. Yeah, so
nice.
One is it's called Joseph Ellicott and the Holland Land Company by William Chazanoff, so Chazanoff, came out in 1970. So that's probably the largest work that's still available. There's also two that I also have behind me here that have been out of print for a long time, but if you look on your antique book sites, you might be able to find them. One is called The Holland Land Company by Paul Evans, which was published by the Buffalo Historical Society in 1924, which has a lot of interesting information, and it has a very good chapter on the storming of the land office. And then probably the most definitive work, which if you can find it, you're very lucky, is The Pioneer History of the Holland Purchase, which was written by O. Turner in 1849.
Oh.
Now, in our holdings, we have a couple other books that have been published much more recently. One through the Buffalo History Museum on the Holland Land Office, and basically this whole topic I just covered is covered in about 15 pages. It's a nice little quick read. And then one of our previous directors, whose basis I've created this PowerPoint off of, wrote a book on the life of Joseph Ellicott, which talks a lot about what's going on with the purchase overall. And that's about 25 pages. So there aren't a lot of real thick volumes, at least available anymore, but you can find they're kind of more dispersed than other topics, really.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just saw it pop up as an aside to since we're on the book question. Are there any books that are particularly discussing the settlers of the Holland Land Company?
There aren't a lot of sort of micro analysis of it unless you're getting into family histories. But
yeah.
Just because there's so many stories, you really need to look, if you want to look for prominent settlers, look for those names, and it'll give you a better idea. Because most of it's taken from a very macro approach.
Yeah.
And just because you bought in the Holland Land Purchase, your situation could be completely different, depending on where you were. So, and even when you came. So, if you're looking for a individual level, it's better to look for, try to find maybe a prominent member, a prominent settler in your area. There might be something written about them, and that would probably give you a better idea than a lot of these volumes.
Okay. Yeah. And so somebody asked, how did you become interested in the Holland Land Company?
Well, when I took this job, before I became the director here in 2017, and before that, I had actually never heard of the Holland Land Company.
So it was kind of a learn by trial thing.
It was, I learned because I had to, but it's definitely heightened my interest in local history because it really covers all of it. I had done some work in my hometown, and I was looking at maps and not really knowing where they came from. And then I came here and was seeing those same maps. So it kind of all came together for me in a way. A little anecdote, one of my first couple weeks here, I was going through something and I found those ledgers from Erie County, and I just pulled one out, not even knowing what I was looking at. And I grew up in the town of Eden in Erie County, and that's the book I pulled out, not even realizing it. So it kind of brought it all together for me. But yeah, this was not something I was necessarily interested in beforehand, but having to work with it, it's become my passion, I guess.
Yeah. Let's see here. And some of these, I think some of the questions are fairly detailed. So you know, if it's something you'd rather have people email the museum about, you know, something you can answer later too, just feel free. Because we can always just post, you know, a contact email.
I'll try to give my I'll try to give my short version, and then maybe I can
Exactly. Yeah.
individually.
Somebody asked, can you speak to the Mile Reserve along the Niagara and its survey?
So I guess the quick answer on that is that was actually left out of the original Holland purchase because that was kept by the government as protection. So essentially, from Fort Niagara down to Buffalo was set aside so that they could build forts or military emplacements to protect against Canada.
Great. I see. Let's see, I'm just kind of scrolling down here to see what we can cover. I think you might have kind of covered this, but can you explain how the Senecas lost the Buffalo Creek Reservation?
And again, I'll give the short version on this. It's more complicated than I'll be able to tell right now, but essentially, as soon as the reservations are set up, white settlers are trying to take the land. I mean, it's almost right away, but the Buffalo Creek is sought after because they start to realize that that land is actually very valuable because Buffalo is growing and it's butting up right against the reservation. So several times throughout the 1820s and 30s, they actually try to get the Senecas to sell it. And actually in 1836, they get them to, but it was done illegally. So it actually goes to the Supreme Court and gets overturned and goes back to the Senecas. But eventually, 1848 is when the Creek Reservation is sold off. The Senecas do sell it off. Now, how ethical the sale was can obviously be debated heavily, and it's obviously wasn't done in probably too much good faith, but that was actually done with the Ogden Land Company. So that was after the Holland Land Company ceased to be. The Ogden Land Company is one of those companies that steps in and fills the void. A lot of it's done through what they called sales, but they were much more forced than we might think. So.
And I think there was a lot of discussion that was back and forth about some details, but I think that pretty much covered everyone that as far as outside of the specific detail. Do you have like a email for the Holland Land Museum that people might be able to contact you to if they have further questions or details that we could maybe we could put it in the chat here?
Yeah, that's fine. So the main email for the museum is hollandlandoffice@gmail.com.
All right.
You can also find that on our website, which is hollandlandoffice.com. You can even message us through Facebook because I can respond through that too. But email is probably the best way if you have a really pressing question or want to know some more details. I'm more than happy to share that with you.
Great. Well, thanks, Ryan. It was great having you on. I'm happy that we could provide this presentation for everyone, and I hope everyone enjoyed. And you can tune in on let me just get my notes here. The 23rd for Brenty Price's presentation. He's from the Buffalo Presidential Center, and that will be on campaign symbolism and the elephants and donkeys. So we've got some interesting lineup for this month. So anyways, thanks again, Ryan, and we'll be in touch.
All right, thank you.